Hello, everyone. This is Cody Lee of BlackCatBooks.org, author of I the Dragon, Cruel and Beautiful Rabbit Hole Lore and for the upcoming Jaw of the Dragon. I feel a little bit remiss that I have not talked a little bit about Cereza and the Lost Demon on this channel because this has been a very surprising, pleasant departure from the Bayonetta franchise. So much so that I'm really questioning like why Capcom hasn't been able to do something similar with any of their other IPs, something like Resident Evil or Devil May Cry or Street Fighter. Like every time they try to make something like this, they tend to like drop the ball, right? Like the only thing I can think of like maybe is like Mega Man Battle Network, but that's so different from like classic Mega Man. It almost feels like its own thing. Like when you look at like Cereza and the Lost Demon, you really get a sense that like Platinum Games and Nintendo created something that's like very novel and unique, something that harkens back to that mid 2000s period where Clover was allowed to do all sorts of wild creative things, putting out titles like Okami, Beautiful Joe, God Hand. Like you really get a sense that they really went all out in making this game feel unique and distinct from everything else like it. They described it going into release as being rather like an indie game in presentation and style, and I was really concerned about that because I have been really turned off from indie games lately because too often I keep hearing that like this game is a masterpiece, this game is one of the best games ever made. Toby Fox is like one of the greatest game designers of all time. Like it's been like such a long period of time where like I've just heard all this nonsense about people who really don't deserve it, you know? Like all this praise like lobbied at games that really don't deserve any attention whatsoever. So I was worried that like Platinum was actually going to kind of imitate that mindset, like really making the game like too deep, like making the game like focused on like deep social commentary or focused on like you know like all these typical like indie game bait topics. But instead, what we got was a very pleasant, very traditional fairy tale structure about like a young girl, Cereza, getting lost in the woods and having to go on an adventure. It really does feel like the sort of story you would read as a kid. You know, like about the girl who gets who ends up in a place she shouldn't be and has to like fight her way out, and along the way she meets new friends and interacts with nature and like finds out things about herself. Like it is one of those like iconic like archetypal stories, I think. And I do think that needs to be said about this game going into this. Like one of the things that really stick out to me as a creator is that this is the best Bayonetta story so far. Like I don't think there's any disputing that. I think like the story in this game was actually put forward first, as opposed to like the typical Bayonetta formula of putting the gameplay first. And it would be easy to assume this might be a bad thing. In fact, I would almost certainly say it is, especially early on, where like it's very cutscene focused and like you're doing chores for like your master or whatever. You're It feels like very cutscene focused. It feels like almost kind of boring. It feels kind of dry. You don't really understand like what makes it a game initially. It's very slow paced to start off with. So much so that like in my initial video, I was kind of concerned about the state of the game, but what the game itself would be like. But you know, you eventually unlock your character, your second character, Treasure, who has a bunch of moves of his own, and like you know, you end up utilizing him and Cereza in unique, fun ways. You know, being able to move two characters at the same time. It's simplistic, but it works really well. Like it really does feel as if like Cereza, as she goes through the game, is like acquiring new skills, acquiring new powers, and really like becoming who she is going to be, right? Like Bayonetta origins. This is how she becomes Bayonetta. You really get this sense that like wow, they really put a lot of work into like the making sure the continuity was sound, making sure that making sure that Bayonetta's background was set. You know, establishing new characters, establishing like utilizing established lore in interesting ways. Like Rosemary is a demon repellent in Bayonetta, and like there's a lot of it growing in the forest, so Treasure can't cross it. So like you have to have Bayonetta, Cereza go through and like interact with like whatever's past there, and like try to get like Treasure past it. You know, like there is a lot to like about this game. honestly. It really does feel as if in a lot of ways there are certain developers like Platinum and Nintendo that are returning to that classic mindset of like trying to make something unique and different. And this game really exceeds at that in spades. All right. It really does feel like a positive spin on like the typical indie game formula. Like I've played a ton of indie games like this, but none of them have like the same kind of presentation. None of them have as good voice acting. None of them have as good like combat or level design or even puzzle solving, which is surprisingly good in this game. Like in the plot itself, like ties itself back into like the mainline Bayonetta games. So much so that if you're a hardcore fan like me, oh by the way, my books are heavily influenced by Bayonetta, so you know that I'm a big fan of the franchise. Uh, if you're a big fan of the franchise like me, you know that you'll recognize things. You'll recognize characters, people's ideas, plot points that are like just kind of emphasized here in strange, interesting, and unique ways. Right? Like after Bayonetta 3, in which Cereza did not appear at all, it's so incredibly refreshing to see her here in a fully fledged game of her own, right? Going out on an adventure, right? And her, Babynetta, we're calling it. It just feels like such a nice, interesting spin on like an established character. It doesn't feel pandering or forced. It feels like very, very natural. So much so that like I have a hard time like thinking that like any real fan of Bayonetta wouldn't appreciate this in some capacity. That was actually one of my concerns going into this was that like, how much fun is this going to be for an established fan of Bayonetta? Like, aren't they like the most hardcore like action game fans out there? Bayonetta is like the best action game on the market right now. Bayonetta 3 like stomped Devil May Cry 5. So like, is like simplifying things and focusing on like a different aspect of the character like going to be a detriment, or is it going to be a positive? And like there are things to be like arguments to be said about like the simplistic nature of the combat and the boss fights, and I don't believe the game even has like difficulty settings. But there are things to argue about that in that nature. There are things to argue about, like when it comes to like whether this game is a better than Bayonetta 3 or not. But like when all is said and done, like the product itself is spectacular. Surprisingly so. I was not expecting this game to be as good as it is, and I think one of my other complaints in that video I made, talking about my first impressions in that demo, I thought I had the very distinct impression that, like a lot of indie games, this would be way too short, and it doesn't feel that way at all. If anything, I'm kind of shocked at how long it is. Like, from what I understand, it's like 15 hours long. And if you know anything about like the average game length, that's longer than like Luigi's Mansion 3. That's longer than like I think Pikmin 3. That's longer than like quite a few Nintendo games like WarioWare Get It Together. Like I was worried the $60 price tag would be kind of steep, but like looking at the value I've gotten out of this game already, seeing those gorgeous visuals, seeing how clever like the puzzles can be at times, seeing like the surprising amount of variety and depth, like seeing how many like new powers you can get, like seeing like how cleverly like Cheshire and Cereza are utilized in combat situations, seeing how like well put together this game is. Like I speculated that like Platinum had made a comeback with Bayonetta 3. Like I commented on it how it felt like like something they would have put out like back in their heyday in like the early tens, right? Like I was talking about that. Like, I mentioned that. And with Cereza and the Lost Demon, seeing like a brand new IP, with the seeing a brand new like take on like the Bayonetta IP in this like fun new like spin-off series with this unique aspect, like creative, fun design, like interesting characters, great story, fun gameplay. I think it's official. I think Platinum has returned to form. I think if this partnership with Nintendo continues, if they continue putting out games like this, they are going to be a major asset to the company. They are going to put out some of the best games for hardcore gamers in the industry exclusively on Nintendo Switch. I don't know how well this game is doing, like sales wise, and let it be known that I don't really care. Like, I kind of regret how much I emphasized that point in that video I made, like talking about it, because when all is said and done, like for gamers, for people like us, The thing that matters most is the game itself. And in this case, Cereza and the Lost Demon is a fantastic video game.